Hey everybody, I'm Jeremy with Widen Woodworks. Welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how I made this smart device charger. My wife has a knack for letting horizontal surfaces get super cluttered. In an attempt to make her side table a little bit more organized, I made her this charging station to charge her phone and her watch at the same time. The whole thing is made from an oak cutoff from another project, and I took a 2-in-1 charger and ran the wires through the block and out the back, so now she only has to deal with one cable. The bottom is covered in a piece of leather to both hide the cables and protect the side table. I had to learn how to solder, so I'll rate this project as intermediate, but it's really not all that hard. This is a longer video, so let's jump on in. I started the project by marking out a block to use from this oak cutoff. I wanted to make sure the pieces were big enough so that I could turn the block into a random geometric shape, so I gave a little bit of extra padding around the edges. I used a grease pencil to mark the lines because it's easier to see the white lines than regular pencil marks when you're putting the piece through a saw. And I'm only marking out a rough shape because I know I'll be milling the pieces down later. With the block all marked out, I took the piece over to my bandsaw. I freehand cut along the lines to cut the blocks out from the larger piece of oak. It's fairly easy to control the wood through the bandsaw, so I just took my time and I got pretty straight cuts. Then I clamped the piece down on my table saw jointing sled, making sure there was about a 1/4 inch overhang. The block was smaller than the clamping area on the sled, so I placed a 1x4 across the block and clamped down on that. Then I ran the piece through the saw, giving me a perfectly straight edge. I placed that straight edge up against the fence of my miter saw so that I could cut the block into 2 pieces. This oak is pretty dense, so I made multiple small passes instead of trying to cut it all at once. The mill that I got this piece from left some bandsaw marks on the faces of the wood, so I ran the pieces through the planer a few times, just to remove the marks. To glue the blocks together, I used Titebond 2 wood glue, and I used a rubber spatula to make sure that both faces had a generous covering. Then I clamped together the pieces using a bunch of F-style clamps. I used a rag to clean up the glue squeeze out, but I knew that I'd be lopping off pieces, so I wasn't really too thorough with it. I let the glue dry until the next day, so that it was 100% cured. Then I took the block out of the clamps. I measured all the way around the block to allow for a 1/2 inch border. Then I measured and marked the separate areas for the phone and watch. I used a Sharpie to draw on the rough shape of what I wanted the top to look like, then I brought it over to the bandsaw. Shaping the charging station is definitely the most creative part of this project. I used the bandsaw to take off random bits, mostly just feeling it out as I went, but I started by cutting out sections based off of the lines I had drawn on the top. This way I was sure that the top face would remain large enough to fit both of the charging blocks and the devices. For the rest of it, I would just take a look at the block and cut an angle that felt right. Cutting angles like this could be a bit dangerous, so I just took my time and kept my hands plenty far away from the blade. If you don't have a bandsaw, you could use a disc sander or even a belt sander mounted to a tabletop to create the angles. To make the device blocks, I took a smaller piece of the oak cutoff and ripped it down to width at the table saw. Then I cut them down to length at the miter saw. When I make cuts on the miter saw on small pieces like this, I use a scrap piece of wood to hold the pieces down while I'm cutting. This makes sure I'm not putting my hand too close to the blade of the saw. It was at this point that my wife looked at the block and decided it was too thick. So I took it back over to the bandsaw and resawed it in half. I used the glue line as my center mark and set my fence so that I was cutting just above that line. Then I ran it through the planer one more time just to remove the bandsaw marks. I chucked a 1/8 inch round over bit into my palm router and ran over all of the edges of the device blocks. I kept the bottom edges straight so that when I glue them to the station, they keep that crisp edge. Before I glued the blocks to the station, I needed to cut a recess to house the watch charger. I did this by first finding the center point of the block. I used a straight edge to mark diagonal lines across the block, and this gave me the exact center. Then I used a 1 1/8 inch Forstner bit to drill out the recess. Since the block was so small, I clamped it up into a set of quick clamps so that I had more to hold on to while I drilled. I drilled down until the watch charger sat just barely proud of the edge. Then I marked out a recess for the cable to flow through, and I used a chisel to cut this out, taking my time to make sure I didn't take too much away. Now with all the pieces cut, I could start sanding. I used my random orbit sander with 80 grit paper and ran over all of the sides of the platform and both device blocks. And because the device blocks were so small, I again used a quick clamp to give me better control. I worked my way through the grits, starting with 80, then 120, and finally with 220. Sanding is always the most time-consuming part of the project, but it's important to do so you get a nice, smooth finish on your final piece. Once I had everything sanded down, I could glue the device blocks to the main charging platform. I used a straight edge to align the blocks and make sure that they were parallel with each other. Then I used a pencil to mark all the way around each block. I applied glue to the bottoms of both blocks and onto the marked out areas of the platform. Then I clamped on the pieces. I started by only loosely clamping so that I would have enough wiggle room to adjust the blocks into the right place. Then I slowly applied more pressure until they were fully clamped down, and I used a wet rag and the paddle end of my glue brush to clean up any squeeze out. I set it aside to let the glue dry, then removed it from the clamps. Off camera, I aligned and made a mark on the bottom of the platform that was in line with the recess for the watch cable. Then I used a 9/64 bit to drill a hole through to the top. This bit is just wider than the cable I'm using, so it should fit snug but still be able to run through the hole. To make a hole for the phone cable, I started by countersinking with a 1/4 inch Forstner bit. I angled the bit slightly so that when the charger is in and the phone is on it, it leans back against the block. I used painter's tape to mark the depth for the countersink so that it didn't drill too deep. Then I used the 9/64 bit to drill the hole for the cable to run through. The next thing I needed to do was to cut out recesses for the cables to run out the bottom of the platform. I did this by using a series of Forstner bits to drill out small cavities where the cables could poke through. Then I used a larger 2-inch bit to drill out an area for the Y-split after I solder everything together. I drilled this area out deeper than the first two to make sure I had plenty of room left over to glue the cables in. I learned from how hard it was to use a chisel to cut out the cable area on the device block, so I picked up a cheap set of wood carving tools to cut the channels for the cables on the underside of the platform. I used a U-shaped gouge and a soft mallet to make quick work of these channels. I made one channel from each of the smaller holes to the larger hole, and one channel from the larger hole out the back of the platform. These channels allow the cables to have space so they don't sit proud of the bottom. Before applying finish, I cleaned up the pencil marks and any glue squeeze out on the device blocks by hand sanding with 800 grit sandpaper. Then I used a clean rag to apply a coat of shellac all over the charging station, making sure not to get any in the watch recess or the phone countersink, as I'll be using epoxy in these later. I set the station aside to dry for about a half hour, then came back and sanded the whole thing with 400 grit sandpaper. I hand sanded to get the small spaces in between the device blocks. Then I used a rag to remove any leftover dust before applying a second coat of shellac. Once that coat had dried, I ran over the whole thing very lightly with 800 grit sandpaper, just to remove any tackiness left over from the finish. With all of the woodworking done for this project, I could move on to the electrical portion. I needed to solder together the individual charging cables with the Y cable. I'm very new to soldering and am not an expert in it, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I did. But I'll link to some videos I found useful down in the description. I started by using wire cutters to strip away the outer casing of the cables, then stripped each individual cable to expose the wire inside. Luckily, all of these cables are color-coded, so making the right connections is a breeze. I tinned the tip of my soldering iron by melting a bit of solder right onto it. Then I pushed the two ends of the cables together and twisted a bit so that they made a good connection. I used the iron to melt the solder onto the cables. To make sure there was plenty on each connection, I gently tugged on the wires to see if they pulled apart. When they didn't, I wrapped each connection with a bit of electrical tape. I repeated this process for all the cables in each strand and on both cables. Once I had made all of the connections, I slid the heat shrink tube over each bundle and used a heat gun to shrink it down. The tubing will help protect the new connections. And as a note, remember to slide the tubes onto either end of the connections before soldering. I forgot to do that and I had to redo the connections. Twice. I used 5-minute epoxy to set the cables into place on the charging station. Quick setting epoxy is super easy to use. Just squeeze a bit out and mix it together. I used the back end of a cheap brush. Once it was mixed, I used the brush to apply epoxy to the inside of the watch block. I was careful not to overdo this as I didn't want any to get on the face of the station. Then I pressed the watch charger into place and held it until it stayed on its own before moving on to the phone charger. I poured epoxy into the countersunk hole and held the cable in place until the epoxy had cured enough for it to stay on its own. I let the epoxy set for a few hours before turning the station over and gluing the cables down. I just used hot glue to set the cables into their recesses. Then with the cables in place, I could add a piece of leather to the bottom. I placed the station on top and cut a chunk of the leather out using a pair of scissors. Then I applied contact cement to both the leather and the bottom of the station. I let the cement dry just to the point that it didn't stick to my finger when I touched it. Then I pressed the station down onto the leather. I had left the bottom of the station unfinished so that the contact cement could bond straight to the wood instead of to the shellac. I cut away the excess leather using a sharp blade in my utility knife, then sanded down the edges with 400 grit paper. To finish the leather and give it a bit of protection, I applied leather conditioner. Once the conditioner had dried, the charging station was done. Adding this station to my wife's nightstand really helps tidy it up. Now there's only one cable to manage, and because it goes off the back of the table, she won't be constantly knocking her phone and watch onto the floor. We're both super happy with how the whole thing came out. The shellac really makes the grain of the oak pop, and the random geometry looks both organic and not, which is definitely my wife's style. Plus, because of this project, I picked up a new skill, so that's a big win-win. Doing projects that are both functional and look great adds so much warmth to a room. A charging station like this can add a lot of personal style and really help clean up a workspace or nightstand. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, drop some comments down below, and make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. I'll see you next time.